So a quick introduction to Richard, and then the floor's yours. So Richard first studied economic history and the philosophy of science at LSE before training in epidemiology. He is a professor emeritus of social epidemiology. Apologies, science isn't my strongest suit, Richard. Thank you so much. At the University of Nottingham Medical School, honorary professor at the University College London, and a visiting professor at the University of York. Since his initial research focused on health inequalities, his books and research papers have drawn attention to the tendency of societies with bigger income differences between rich and poor to suffer a heavier burden of health and social problems. So two of his books have been the subject of documentary films: The Great Leveller for the Channel 4's TV Equinox series, broadcast in 1996, and this was based on his Unhealthy Societies. The Divide, based on The Spirit Level, was released in April 2016, available on Netflix, and The Spirit Level, written with Kate Pickett, is now available in 24 languages. It also won the 2011 Political Studies Association Publication of the Year Award and the 2010 Bristol Festival of Ideas Prize. It's now available in 25 editions worldwide, and The Spirit Level has sold over 300,000 copies. In his TED Talk, How Economic Inequality Harms Societies, has been watched over 3 million times. Richard has received the Solidar's Silver Rose Award, the Irish Cancer Society's Charles Cully Memorial Medal, and was the Australian Society for Medical Research medalist in 2017. He and Kate Pickett published their latest book, The Inner Level, in 2018. So without further ado, Richard, the floor is yours.
Right, thank you, Chris and Anthony. It's nice to be able to talk to you all. I must say, I thought the only advantage from my point of view of the pandemic was that people did know what epidemiology was. And before, people used to think it was something to do with skin diseases, but actually it's more to do with the roots of the word epidemics, and it's the statistical side of looking at the causes of disease. You know, have people who get this or that cancer been exposed to more of this chemical at work? All that kind of work, establishing links between health issues and what you might have been exposed to, your life course. We've used the same methods to look at the effects of inequality, by which I mean the large income differences between rich and poor within societies. I want to share my screen so I can show you a lot of slides from our work. Now, I think I can do that. So you can now all see my first slide, can you? Good. A few nods and yes, thank you. The peacock and the pigeon are really one of the effects of inequality is people get more sort of narcissistic and up themselves, but I'll come on to that later. What I really want to convince you of is that inequality is, it changes the nature of social relationships in a society. People used to think of it only in very simple material terms, that inequality, those income differences between rich and poor, only mattered if it created terrible poverty or something like that. But actually, it's much more important because it increases the issues of feelings of superiority and inferiority, dominance and subordination. If you like, it increases that idea that some people are worth much more than others in our society. And that has numerous effects that I'll take you through, with really extraordinarily damaging consequences for individuals and the whole quality of our lives in society. Our spirit level book is now quite old, but what we used were just figures on the scale of the gap between the richest 20% in each society and the poorest 20%. You know, are the top 20% 4 times as rich, or 6 or 8 times as rich as the bottom 20%? And so this rainbow graph shows you that in the more equal countries on the left, the top 20% got 3 or 4 times as much as the bottom 20%. But in the more unequal countries on the right, UK, Portugal, USA, Singapore, the gap is twice as big. Those figures have changed for some countries quite substantially since we did that work. All our data is simply downloaded from international sources. So when anything to do with death rates comes from the World Health Organization, other figures from OECD or the EU or sources of that kind. We never compile the data ourselves. Our worry was that that would introduce a possible element of bias if we were to compile our own data. And what we did was basically take those figures of inequality for those rich developed countries and simply compare them to the prevalence of a range of health and social problems. And basically you find that a huge range of problems get worse as income differences get bigger. The surprise is that they don't just get worse amongst the poor. They get worse. The biggest effects of inequality are on the poor, but you see even well-off middle-class people in more unequal societies, it affects their life expectancy and so on. One of the first things we did was compile this graph. You see that list of issues on the left: life expectancy, kids' maths and literacy scores, infant mortality rates, homicide rates, and so on, all the way down. We downloaded those again from international sources. I mean, I remember, as I said, life expectancy from World Health Organization, trust from the International Values Survey, and obesity from the International Obesity Task Force. So those sorts of sources. Here you see them arranged from worst scores at the top. Higher scores are bad. And what you're seeing is the more unequal countries, USA, Portugal, and UK, do worse on all those kinds of problems than the more equal countries at the bottom left. It's really quite a tight relationship. And basically, if you do well on some of these problems, a country does well on some, tends to do well on most of them. So those Scandinavian problem countries not only have a higher life expectancy, but people trust each other more, they have less mental illness, more social mobility, compared to the USA, which has the highest homicide rates of almost any country, more people in prison. It has lower life expectancy than most of the other rich developed countries. That sort of picture is what you're seeing. We were worried that people would think we'd chosen these problems just to fit this picture. So we also looked at the United Nations, the Unicef Index of Child Wellbeing. It's an index made up, nothing to do with us, which contains, I think, about 40 different components. So whether children can talk to their parents, whether there's bullying in schools, how they do in these international maths and literacy tests, what child immunization rates are like. All that goes into this measure of child well-being. And in this graph, the lowest scores are doing worst. So you see USA, Portugal, UK doing badly in terms of that measure of child well-being. So very much the same picture as what I've showed you in the previous graph. I could show you all these for each of those components. We did a paper first in the British Medical Journal and then in Pediatrics, a journal of medicine for and medical problems in children, looking at the different components. We also, in the spirit level, show the different components in that previous graph in relation to inequality. So trying to summarize the overall picture, issues to do with social relations that are statistically significantly related to inequality include measures of child conflict, bullying, and so on, homicide rates, imprisonment rates, measures of social capital, social cohesion, how much people feel they can trust others, and then in red, you see the different measures we found were related to inequality, drug abuse, infant mortality, life expectancy, mental illness, obesity, and then in blue, you see human capital issues. We looked at these not only internationally amongst the kind of group of countries I've shown you, but also in a separate test bed. We looked at the 50 American states, asking just the same question. Do the more unequal American states, the ones with the bigger income gaps, do worse on all these kind of problems? And the picture is very, very similar. Almost everything that's worse in more unequal countries is worse in more unequal American states. So it's a consistent picture. I may say this isn't simply a picture that we've shown. I suppose we extended it to a lot of the, from health and violence, where the first work on health and violence in relation to inequality was done in the 1970s. We extended it to these other measures. Just recently, it's clear that COVID mortality and incidence has been much higher in countries with bigger income differences. There are now, those 4 papers, there may be a 5th around now, showing that in all these in peer-reviewed journals. So it's a very general pattern. I've shown you data only for the rich developed countries, but there are many papers now on looking at these issues in much poorer countries. Of course, you can't get figures on mental illness and social cohesion and many of those things you can't get good internationally comparable data on some of those issues, but you can get good internationally comparable data on infant mortality, usually life expectancy, sometimes homicide rates, and the picture looks very similar. The really important difference is that in poorer countries, GNP per capita makes a difference. So you see these infant mortality rates, they come sliding down in the early stages of economic growth as GNP per capita begins to rise. These 3 lines show the levels of infant mortality for the most unequal countries in blue, the higher infant mortality, higher all the way across the whole course of economic development, and then in green, the low inequality countries with lower infant mortality, again, throughout the course of economic development. So I'm not going to show you poorer countries, but there is work on fewer outcomes where you can get data, which shows the picture is largely the same, i.e. the damaging effects of inequality. Basically, economic growth makes less and less difference as we get richer. You know, in poorer countries, it's really important that people have higher living standards because many haven't got basic necessities. But for us in the rich world, to have more and more of everything makes less and less difference to measures, for instance, of life expectancy or happiness, well-being measures, and so on. So, you know, we consume more resources, but it doesn't really help measures of human well-being very much, but it does in poorer countries. I want now to show you what I think is one of the most fundamental effects of inequality. It shows its divisiveness. And I think since before the French Revolution, many people have had a sort of intuition that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. And now that you can look at the data, it's quite clear that people's involvement, for instance, in community life wanes, it reduces in more unequal countries. So this is a measure of whether people belong to voluntary groups, local groups, civic groups of different kinds, whether they're gardening clubs or choirs or whatever, and it all declines with higher inequality. I'm using here other people's work sometimes. Most of these relationships have been shown now many times. Also measures of trust. For instance, whether you agree that most people can be trusted. There's a different question in the American General Social Survey. It asks people, do you think people would take advantage of you if they got the chance? And you find that the trust disappears with greater inequality. There's now also a paper showing that people are less willing to help each other where there's more inequality, less willing to help old people, the disabled, and so on. So you see a sort of reciprocity in community life weakening. And actually many papers now showing that violence increases. These are homicide rates, and the red dots are American states, the 50 American states, and the blue triangles are Canadian provinces. Note the huge differences on the vertical axis. In those blue triangles, there are around 15 homicides per million, and the higher red dots are around 150. So there's a tenfold difference in homicide rates, quite closely related to inequality. And as I say, that's been studied many times. If you go to places where inequality is much bigger than in the countries I've been showing you, more unequal than the United States or Britain, places like Mexico or South Africa, you find it's gone a stage further. People there seem to be frightened of each other. So there are bars on the windows and doors and these great fences around people's property with razor wire at the top. And similar picture in South Africa. This is the wires on the top, of course, are an electric fence. The blurred notice there says armed response. So if you're caught climbing in, you might get shot. So, you know, where there's great inequality, people are worried about attacks of different kinds, of people breaking in. People are frightened of each other. They've lost that social cohesion, that reciprocity, willingness to help people, a feeling that you can trust others. I think that that's an extraordinarily sad picture, because if you look at the studies of the determinants of happiness or of health, actually, you find that the quality of social relations is crucial. Whether or not people have friends, whether they're involved in community life, is protective of health and a powerful determinant of happiness. So inequality seems to be damaging the sort of center of our social lives together. One other thing I think related directly to this that I think really confirms that little picture I've given you of the effect on social relations is this. It comes from two American economists who showed both internationally and amongst the 50 American states that in more unequal places, a higher proportion of the labor force is involved in what they call guard labor. That means security staff, police, prison officers, people like that. So, you know, as you lose the trust and lose the cohesion, get more violence, as you would expect, more people, this guard labor, the security staff, they're the people we use to protect ourselves from each other. And that goes up, showing the costs of greater inequality. I don't think you should think of this as something sort of unrelated to what we know about class and status issues. I think what we're talking about is whether our societies have a very steep social hierarchy or a much shallower one. Sorry, my phone is ringing, but I think my wife will answer it in a minute. What you see is the whole society, the social structure becomes sort of more ossified. All the problems related to inequality are the problems that tend to be more common at the bottom of society. You know, so all those, there's some obesity and drug abuse and mental illness and so on at the top of society, they're all more common at the bottom of society. It is those problems that are related, as I've been saying, to the extent of income inequality. You also find that residential segregation between rich and poor increases with bigger income differences, and very much as you would expect. But for a student population, interesting that you're less likely to marry someone with a different social class background if you live in a more unequal society. I've shown you that community life weakens and social mobility declines. I can't remember whether my social mobility slide is the next one or comes later, but I have one somewhere. So basically, I think this income inequality stuff is telling us more about the social hierarchy, you know, how steep that is. And social relations are different in a less hierarchical society. Oh yes, this is the social mobility graph. I think we first showed this relationship amongst a smaller number of countries, but this is, I think, a better study than ours. What it's showing you is intergenerational social mobility. What it's asking in a way is, do rich parents have children who remain rich through their lives, or do poor parents have poor children who are poor throughout their lives? And or doesn't parental income matter very much? And basically what this is showing is that where income differences are smaller, parental income is less important in determining your life course. I think that's important because many people say income inequality is fair if everyone can find their right level in society, an idea that if you work hard, you go up in society, and if you don't, you move down. But what this shows is there is less social mobility. And there are now a number of studies showing that. So I think we can be pretty confident of that relationship. I think it's also important to recognize that we're not talking about simply the direct effects of material surroundings on people. We're talking about social differences, comparisons, differences in income between people. I got this slide because I wanted just to read a paragraph from a study where people in poverty, what was regarded as poverty in different societies, were interviewed about the experience of poverty. And it interviewed poor people in Uganda, India, China, Pakistan, Korea, United Kingdom, and Norway. And of course, poverty means totally different things in those societies. In India, it means living in something as awful, perhaps, as that picture on the right. In Norway, being poor might mean living in a 2 or 3 bedroom flat with many of the modern electronics and central heating and so on. But why the study is important is when they interviewed people in poverty, they found the experience was very, very similar, despite these extraordinary material differences in what counted as poverty. Respondents universally despised poverty and frequently despised themselves for being poor. Parents were often despised by their children, women despised their menfolk, and some men were reported to take out their self-loathing on their partners and children. Despite respondents generally believing that they had done their best against all odds, they mostly considered that they had both failed themselves by being poor and that others saw them as failures. This internalization of shame was further externally reinforced in the family, the workplace, and in their dealings with officialdom. Even children couldn't escape this shaming. With the possible exception of Pakistan, school was an engine of social grading, a place of humiliation for those without the possessions that guaranteed social acceptance. And it finishes saying, for men, relying on others or on welfare benefits was perceived as a challenge to their sense of masculinity. A British father of 2 children admitted, "I feel like shit. I'm the man in this relationship. I'm meant to be the man to take care of the missus and the kids, and I don't." So understand inequality in terms, as I say, right at the beginning, of social relationships, of superior and inferiority, and our sensitivity to issues around social status and how other people see us. There have now been studies which show that mental illnesses and personality disorders are often exacerbated or intensified, triggered by issues to do with dominance and subordination. Sherry Johnson and colleagues at Berkeley reviewed a huge amount of psychological research and showed these connections. I actually, after seeing this paper, got in touch with the author and said, and I think she had thought that all societies have a social hierarchy and they're much of a muchness. But I got in touch and I said that I think research is already beginning to show you're right, that more unequal societies have more of the mental illnesses you're talking about. And recently, and that paper was, 2012. Last year, this paper came out in the British Medical Journal, showing that and eating disorders, anxiety, schizophrenia, depression, ADHD, ASD, were all much more common in more unequal societies. The blue bars are the strength of the correlation between the prevalence of mental illnesses and the levels of inequality. And so you see strong correlations in most of them. And actually, we know these issues to do with how you're seen and judged by other people, what psychologists call the social evaluative threat, your worries about how you're seen and judged, that were particularly sensitive to those kinds of stressors, that if you measure central stress hormones like cortisol, they are particularly sensitive to those kinds of sources of stress. We also know that people are more worried about status, have greater status anxieties, more worried about other people's judgments of them if they live in a more unequal country. What you're seeing on this graph is deciles of the income distribution. So the poorest tenth of the population are on the left and the richest tenth on the right. The top line is the levels of status anxiety in more unequal societies, higher across all income groups than in the low inequality countries, that bottom line. So if you live in one of those steep social hierarchies with big differences, we judge each other more by status and we worry more about how others judge us. I think that's really important in terms of how it feeds into the stuff I've just mentioned to do with mental illness. If you're worried about, how you're judged all the time, you may quite well just feel social connections, social meetings, gatherings are just too stressful. You worry that you're not smart enough, you're not attractive, you haven't got enough to say, you're not funny, and so on. And withdraw from social relations. We all know those kinds of anxieties. Another response to the same kinds of anxieties is you big yourself up. You go in for sort of self-advertisement, self-enhancement, it's called. And both these responses have been found to be more common in more unequal societies. I can show you self-enhancement. That's really self-advertisement or bigging yourself up, is higher in more unequal societies. So this is a study where people were asked, how do you think you compare with the average in your society on different dimensions? So they were asked, do you think you're cleverer than most people in Britain? Do you think you're more generous? Do you think you're more attractive? All that kind of question. And people big themselves up. It's really like, you probably know the joke that people in the United States, 96% of them think they're better drivers than average. Way above what is, of course, possible. Drug use is more common in more unequal countries. I suspect that might be partly to deal with all these social anxieties. So, you have a drink before you go out so you can relax with other people. Those kinds of insecurities. But one of the most obvious ways we big ourselves up and try and sort of improve our self-presentation is by consumerism. And again, there are studies that show if you live in more unequal places, you spend more money on flashy cars or clothes with the right designer labels on. And advertisers know this only too well and play on our weaknesses. people say, but haven't human societies always been terribly unequal? Aren't we always landed with this? But that shows a real ignorance of the norm for hunting and gathering societies, which cover 90% of our existence as anatomically modern human beings with brains the current size. Those societies were almost always remarkably egalitarian. I think I'm going to stop there, except perhaps for just what we can do about it. If you look at trends in inequality over the 20th century, you find that inequalities were high until about the 1930s, where they start to come down, and you get a long, slow decline in inequality from sometime in the 1930s until the late 1970s. And you see that broadly similar pattern in different countries. And from 1980 onwards, the modern rise of inequality. And I think that is to a considerable extent, first the rise of the labor movement, socialist ideology, the fear of communism, and then all that disappearing with the advent of free market fundamentalism, Reagan, Thatcher, the reduction in top tax rates, legislation to weaken trade unions, the privatization movement, which starts that upward movement in income differences. And you can see that in most countries, you see this pattern of a relationship between what happens to inequality in that red line, that U-shaped pattern that I've just shown you, and the bottom one is the proportion of the labor force in trade unions. So when the labor movement and the social democratic parties were strong, inequality came down, and when it was weak, as it weakened, inequality grew again. So I think basically we must extend democracy into the economy. Theresa May, actually, in her campaign for the leadership, talked about introducing legislation for employee representation on company boards. I'm sure it would have only been token representation, but she was talked out of that. There is now, I think, quite a strong movement, or at least strong interest in more democratic workplaces. Indeed, about half the member countries of the European Community have some legislation for employee representation. In Germany, it's quite strong. In the big companies, half the representatives on the remuneration committees have to be employees. So although we must do something about tax evasion, tax avoidance, tax havens, the fact that income tax is taxes are no longer progressive, we must also reform our economy, extending democracy into it, which I think would also make our political democracy more meaningful. I think in many ways it's less meaningful than it should be and was. But I think if we extend democracy into the economic sphere, maybe we can do something about that. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Much appreciated.
I can't hear you, Chris.
Oh, can you not?
I can now.
Ah, brilliant. There we are. So yeah, thank you very much for your briefing. It was really interesting and covered a wide variety of topics. So what I'm going to quickly do for those interested is to put a link to the Equality Trust in the chat for anyone that's more interested in terms of what Richard does and the Equality Trust as well. So we've got a few questions coming in, which is great. So thank you very much to everyone. So we'll start first off with Ashley. And he asks, what are the key differences you have noticed between countries with lower inequality and those with higher inequalities in terms of the actions that they take to maintain that lower inequality?
It's interesting. There seem to be totally different pathways. When we were writing the Spirit level, we found that there were some countries that started with very big differences in incomes before taxes, so big differences in market incomes, and then had large-scale redistribution through progressive taxes, generous welfare systems. Sweden, for instance, was like that. But then there were countries like Japan, where you find just the opposite, that they had much less redistribution, but the differences in market incomes, pre-tax incomes, was much smaller. We found just the same thing amongst the American states. And it looked to us as if it doesn't much matter how you get your greater inequality, which are those two very different ways, as long as you get it somehow. But it's important to recognize that you can get it quite different ways.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. And Anthony goes to mention more on a UK basis. He says that in the UK, 25% of people lack the basic level of skills in English and mathematics, with the UK having 5 of the poorest cities in the EU and also the richest in London. And so he says, just to sort of narrow it down a bit, that these citizens value security more than freedom and democracy. Do you think this might be one of the main reasons for the Brexit vote and why we have a more nationalist government in the UK?
I think that I think that the sort of populist political agenda developed particularly in countries with bigger income differences. In Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the States, Boris Johnson here, they're all examples of particularly unequal countries which have gone in for those sort of populist agendas. But I think in terms of education, it's important to note that more unequal countries, the data, the UN data, the PISA data on maths and literacy scores amongst young people, their scores are lower in the more unequal countries. And I think that's partly that kids often feel they're regarded as no-hopers, and parents and teachers sometimes concentrate on kids they think are brighter, but that idea that some people are much more capable than others is strengthened by inequality. You know, I think that people at the top in society regard themselves almost as superhuman, and there's a tendency to regard the poor as trash and worthless. And I think all those kinds of prejudices are really increased quite dramatically by inequality. And you see it in that graph I showed you on social mobility. I'm not sure whether that really answers the question, but.
Yeah, no, that's brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. And Michael goes on to say that there is an indisputable correlation between inequality on the one hand and social and health problems on the other. But which is the cause of the other? Could it be that poverty is the factor that makes some individuals determined to escape and rise up the social ladder? And he also goes on to say, is there not an argument that inequality is the consequence, not the cause of social problems?
So which way round is the relationship, basically? Fortunately, there are papers that have, research papers that have looked at the lag periods between changes in inequality and changes in some of these outcomes. So there are actually now indications that being brought up in a very unequal society has lifelong effects on health. But the best papers, I think, show that if you get a rise in inequality, it starts to come through in different age groups and different causes of death over the next 3 to 12 years. So you don't see it straight away in a huge rise in mortality. You see a gradual increase to a new level. At the same time, there's in most of our societies until very recently, we've had a constant background rate of improvement in life expectancy. That's disappeared in some societies, but basically what income inequality used to do is make that background rate of improvement that isn't properly understood a little bit better or a little bit worse. Remind me of the rest of that question.
So, yeah, just in terms of going on to say, is there not an argument that inequality is the consequence?
Yeah, so we know that in several of these outcomes that the changes in inequality come quite a few years earlier. But you see, it's because they are all social problems with social gradients that they move together. And basically what we're saying is that problems that we know are related to social status within our societies get worse when you increase the social status differences. Supposing you ignore the time series data, the lag periods and so on, you then, and think that maybe the relationships are the other way around, you then got to say, why is it that all those problems move together? Why is it that imprisonment and obesity and kids' maths and literacy scores and so on, social cohesion, all affected in a similar direction in these different societies? We say it's because they share a cause, that they are all worse at the bottom of the social ladder, and when you make those differences bigger, it affects them all. But some of them, what's the connection between obesity and income inequality? Are you saying that more unequal, that the inequality is created by things like obesity or infant mortality? Why does that contribute to bigger income differences? So there are a lot of reasons for thinking that the causality cannot be the other way around.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. And Keith goes on to ask, do the examples that you gave throughout your presentation suggest that the filtered down effect is dead if it ever existed in the first place?
You mean income differences, high incomes filtering down, the raising all boats idea? Well, and what we've had for a generation or more, really since 1980, 40 years, is economic growth, admittedly fairly slow, but not filtering down. In the States, lower incomes have hardly changed over that period, while the rich have got much, much richer. We're not quite as extreme as that, but you can see the same basic pattern in Britain. So no, it doesn't raise all boats.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. And Kevin asks, what role does religion play in social cohesion, whether it's a positive or a negative factor in that?
If you look at individuals, it looks as if it's helpful. I think because, well, I think to feel that there is a supremely powerful being who cares about you, looks after you, but also that you're drawn into a community, your local church community. I think those are very helpful things. But if you look at it not at the individual level, but at the societal level, societies that are more religious tend to do worse. And I don't know why that is, but I remember a very important anthropologist, Malinowski, saying that we use religion to deal with the things we cannot control in our lives. And in more unequal societies, I think there's more that you feel just happens is beyond your control, and you are more in need of the assurance of religious belief. I may say that comes from someone without, I used to have a religious belief, but I don't now.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. And Maureen asks, moving on to the topic of suicide rates, as you mentioned previously, and are you able to explain the different relationship that inequality has with the suicide rate?
Yes, as we show in the spirit level, the pattern with suicide is rather, to our initial surprise, the other way round, that suicide tends to be more common in more equal societies. Despite depression being more common in more unequal societies, that is not reflected in differences in suicide. I think that quite a bit of data suggests that suicides and homicides move inversely, that if one's high, the other tends to be lower. And I think there's some truth in that idea that violence either goes out against other people or in against yourself. So imagine that your partner leaves you for somebody else, or you lose your job. Do you blame yourself for that, or do you blame your boss or whoever your partner was? And I think the tendency to blame others is more common in them. It goes with inequality. You know, the world happens to, it's nasty people doing it to me, and so on. Indeed, I think that's quite closely related to why inequality leads to the sort of populist politics. You're up against it. People are not helping you. Everyone's against me, and that kind of thing. And some of the mental illness that goes with that.
Yes, no, definitely. Thank you very much, Richard. And Tom goes on to ask, looking back in the UK in the 1970s, where society here was at its most equal, have there been sort of higher trust levels with child well-being, etc., than other European and Western countries?
I'm afraid I haven't looked at many of these statistics historically, as far back as that. And quite a few of the series we use are fairly modern. So I don't think I can answer that question soundly, but I do think it's clear that and the big rise in inequality from the 70s was really during the 1980s. And it was then that I think since then we've become a more antisocial society. And I think most people of my age feel that in their bones. Sorry, turning around because I thought my wife was wanting to say something to me.
That's all right. And just going off that, Simon asked, in terms of the inequality that increased with the market economy during the 80s, what do you think could change this trend?
Well, I think we've got to change it to move towards sustainability. And I think that greater equality is a key issue, not only because it increases consumerism, as I showed you, people spending more on flashy cars and clothes and stuff, but I think that it makes a society in which, well, you remember that Macron in France proposed raising fuel duty, petrol duty and so on, and was immediately opposed, even before the policy was implemented, by the Gilets jaunes movement all over France in endless different towns and cities. And it went on for months after month. And what they were saying was the fuel duty was unfair. And it developed into a movement saying the whole tax system was unfair. I think it's interesting that during the war, the Second World War, the government apparently decided, this comes from Richard Titmuss, the great historian of social policy during the Second World War. He said that government realized that social hierarchy and inequality had to be reduced to gain people's cooperation in the war effort, to make people feel the burden of war was equally shared. And so those policies of rationing and taxing luxuries and subsidies on necessities to gain people's participation in the war effort. I think that the move towards sustainability requires that we go through some process like that to gain popular support. Otherwise, government policies to deal with the environmental crisis will be opposed by a substantial part of the population. I think it's something that really hasn't been widely recognized, although I think the Green Party has something in its political manifestos about greater equality.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. And going on to Diane and Keith's points, Diane mentions that she feels that in a more equal society, there would be less anxiety about improving one's material wealth. And Keith goes on to say, can it be shown that there is less greed in a more equal society and a greater sense of contentment?
Well, I think that data on consumerism comes pretty close to showing that. And it goes so well with the graph I showed you of status anxiety and that nasty ad, because you're worth it, the L'Oreal ad I showed. And the studies of people who, really spend all their lives shopping and get into terrible debt and so on, show that those people are particularly vulnerable to worries about status. The shopaholics really seem to have pretty bad mental health. And I think it fits into that picture I was suggesting broadly between inequality and mental illness.
Brilliant. And Brendan goes on to a more sort of macro lens of it and saying, is neoliberal economics the cause of this rise in inequality and poverty?
I think some of it would have happened without, but I think it was exacerbated by the reduction of top tax rates and there's no doubt that the strikes in, I think, you remember that, well, you won't remember, but the winter of discontent, I think, was it 79? And that's why I say that we have to move towards forms of economic democracy. Otherwise, you get that conflict in the workplace all the time. It's a way of overcoming it. But one of the interesting patterns is that the societies which most reduced their top tax rates had the biggest rises in incomes before tax. You'd have thought that if you're a rich person, you have to pay less tax, you'd be more satisfied with the bigger part of your income that's left. But actually, what it meant, it suddenly became worthwhile to go in for all these ways of trying to increase income and led to the runaway incomes of the at the top, the runaway top incomes, so that people began to pay themselves millions. And there's a study of, I think, 300 or 400 of the biggest American companies. It shows that in the 1970s up till about 1980, the average gap between the CEO at the top in multinationals and the average production worker, the CEO's got 30 or 40 times as much. But by the first decade in this century, it wasn't just 20 or 30 times as big, it was 200 or 300 times as big, that gap. And that's bad for business. And actually, there are also studies that show that it goes not with better productivity. Paying your CEO so much doesn't improve productivity. It actually is the companies that pay their CEOs less have better shareholder returns. The study I'm thinking of took a 10-year period. It was actually republished, at least the findings, in The Economist and the Wall Street Journal, showing that these top incomes are not earned in terms of better business performance.
Brilliant. And Susan goes on to ask about a more sort of gender lens and asks, does the data reviewed show any differences in attitudes within society on the basis of gender?
I think prejudice against lower social status, any groups that are more vulnerable increases. So I think there's more, women suffer more disadvantage. The pay gap between men and women is bigger in more unequal societies. Gaps in pay between different ethnic groups. All those things increase because it increases those social prejudices. And there is also a process which is, people sometimes call it kicking down or punching down or something, that if you're humiliated, you've had your sense of status and dignity diminished, you feel you're looked down on, you take it out on the people below you. At least I'm better than those bastards, you start to say. And actually this was first recognized not amongst human beings, but amongst non-human primates that have clear ranking systems, that if an animal has lost a battle for status, it starts to beat up the ones below it in the hierarchy. And I'm afraid we do something rather like that. The idea was sort of applied to human beings by people trying to understand Nazi Germany initially.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. And the final question before we wrap up for this evening is from Keith. And he asks, in a more equal society, what can count as a realistic aspiration and material improvement of one's condition if there is little difference in possible attainment?
Well, I think that, and one of the things about inequality, it makes us think that aspirations have to be about getting richer and getting up and so on. That's the way we judge ourselves. One of the interesting things I remember, people used to talk about the problem of the poor was low aspirations in children. You know, that used to be said a lot. And we looked at measures of aspiration, and actually we found in more unequal societies, according to the measures, children had tended to have higher aspirations. They all wanted to be company directors and film directors and superstars and football stars and this kind of thing. Their aspirations were about being richer. Whereas in more equal countries, it was much more acceptable to think that actually I might quite enjoy being a skilled craftsman or a painter, or, you know, there are other ways of developing yourself and your skills and abilities. I thought that was, and the relationships I remember that I just described were not statistically significant, but that was the way round the tendency was. I think that really what matters to human beings is the quality of our social relationships. As I said, that is what powerfully influence happiness and well-being and health. It's how we get on with each other, much more than being richer than each other. That's a nasty competitiveness that we should be able to move away from rather than keep strengthening.
Right. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Richard. And thank you very much, everyone, for your questions. It's much appreciated. What I'll do now is put the links in the chat once again to the Equality Trust.